The United States of America is in grave risk right now. And one of the things that makes us equal in the United States of America is our sacrosanct privilege of voting. And right now that vote is at risk.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Tobin, Editor-in-Chief of the Jewish News Syndicate, JNS.org, and you're listening to Top Story, a weekly podcast where I analyze the most important stories happening in Jewish news around the world. Each week, I will break down politics, foreign policy, and culture to provide insights into what is going on behind the headlines. Hello, and welcome to Top Story. Thanks for joining us. Today, we have something very different for you with an interview with General Michael Flynn, an important military figure who was part of America's conflicts with terrorists in the last generation, as well as one that was the focus of intense controversy on a number of issues. But before we get to that, I want to remind you to like this video and podcast, subscribe to JNS, and click on the bell for notifications. I also want to remind you that you don't have to wait a full week for more Top Story analysis. There is a daily Top Story podcast where I share more news and analysis with you about the most significant issues we're facing today. You can find the daily show under Top Story with Jonathan Tobin on the JNS channel on Apple, Spotify, Google Play, or wherever you get your podcasts. You can find the latest news, including Top Story and other JNS TV content, also by subscribing to Telegram. And now to today's program. There are some people who are both witnesses to history and who, whether they intended or not, become players in the great political struggles of their time and the objects of intense controversy. In today's media environment, we tend to judge people not just by what they may or may not be, their worst moments or failings, but by characterizations of them by opponents that are boiled down to imprecations that can fit neatly into a social media post. In such way, we dismiss them not just as political foes who should be confounded, but also categorize them as evildoers or even anti-Semites, whether or not they actually deserve such labels. Rarely do we take the time to examine the snap conclusions that we can draw about public figures who have been thus canceled or even demonized. And to be fair, this is not what we generally do on this show, where for the most part, we prefer to spend the time we have with you by bringing you conversations with authors, thinkers, and activists whose primary function is to engage in the world of ideas. It is what we're going to try to do today in an interview with Michael Flynn, a retired four-star U.S. general who was primarily known for his role in the 2016 Donald Trump campaign and for being investigated and prosecuted as part of what we now know of as the Russian collusion hoax. Since his brief tenure as Trump's first national security advisor, he has continued to be a figure around whom controversies have swirled, some of them relating to comments that have been interpreted by the Jewish community as insensitive. But when offered an opportunity to talk with him, I thought it would be useful to hear his side of all these controversies, as well as to ask him about what he learned during a lifetime fighting America's wars and working in intelligence. And what follows is our unedited interview with him. Lieutenant General Michael Flynn is a retired Army general with over 33 years of service in the United States military, and is chairman of America's Future, a nonprofit group. His military career culminated as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency and as the nation's highest-serving military intelligence officer. He retired from the Army in 2014 and served in a variety of business and nonprofit roles, and then as a foreign policy advisor to several Republican presidential candidates in 2016. Including Donald Trump, before being appointed as the National Security Advisor. General Flynn is an author, holds 3 master's degrees, and is recipient of numerous military intelligence and law enforcement awards. And along with Michael Ledeen, he wrote the 2016 book, The Field of Fight, How We Can Win the Global War Against Radical Islam and Its Allies, and the 2022 The Citizen's Guide to Fifth-Generation Warfare. General Michael Flynn, welcome to Top Story.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. Thanks for your patience and trying to schedule this. I know jumping through our hoops here, and we're even getting connected here has been always, we always have trials in life, right? There's another trial. This is an easy trial though. So
yeah,
it's great.
We're good
it's
now.
Great.
Thank you. I really appreciate your taking the time to speak with us today. Before we get into the politics and some of the controversies of the last 8 years, I want to start by asking you, as a veteran of all of America's military involvements, really in the last 4 decades, with service and with both the troops in the field and in intelligence, about the nation's security today. You served during the long conflict of the Cold War against the Soviet Union and then the fight against Islamist terrorism. But what are the primary threats we should be thinking about today? Is it China, Islamist terrorists, and Iran, Russia, all of the above? And do you think today's military is still focused on the past rather than the next conflicts we face?
Well, let me just rattle off a couple of things, Jonathan. So I think the top overseas threats are clearly at the top is China, and they are head and shoulders above these next groups that I'll rattle off. Because China is a rising military and economic power, there's no doubt, and people will, say, well, they're on the ropes with their economy, but not really. Russia is a declining power, and I think Russia's got all kinds of issues. They definitely have issues on their southern periphery of the Russian Federation, mainly the rise of Islamism on the Russian southern federation of their boundaries, and I know that that's something that's a big concern to them. But they're also a declining power. They're a declining power militarily. I mean, I think we see that in what's going on in Eastern Europe. I think next to them would be Iran and North Korea, and I think that those are two powers. One, it's interesting, but they're both geographically displaced in some really key places on the planet. The Near East for North Korea, just adjacent to, of course, contiguous with China, and also most people don't know they have a contiguous border with Russia, and of course their close proximity to not only South Korea, obviously on the peninsula, but to Japan, Taiwan, right? The very critical straits of Korea, which are really, really critical. People don't even think at that level of detail. We just think Kim Jong-un and North Korea, and they have some nuclear capabilities. And then you jump back over to Iran, and I still think that Iran is actually one of the more dangerous, and I would say dangerous emotionally because of their hatred. They have their sheer hatred for not only for the United States, but clearly for Israel. They've said it. They've said it there that their willingness to wipe Israel off the map, and their continued calling the United States the Great Satan. So Iran operates, and their government operates from a point of emotion more than really, I think, strategic calculation. Although it doesn't mean that they don't have people who are thinking strategically about some of their issues. I mean, clearly they've been able to cut deals with the left of the inside the United States, inside the Democrat Party here, for billions of dollars for the development of nuclear capabilities, and particularly nuclear missiles. I mean, there's plenty of missiles in Israel or in Iran right now to really do some severe damage over in the Middle East, and particularly against Israel. And then I think so. Those are four: China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. And then I think, sort of what comes next, Jonathan, is a little bit nebulous, a little bit foggy. And I think that you could look at countries like or what I would call this global alliance against the United States, and Venezuela would be at the top of that. You have some others around the world that are starting to emerge, particularly in places like Brazil, where they have a new president there, and he's a he's a stated communist.
Mm-hmm.
But
yeah,
I think
aligned with Venezuela, clearly, yeah.
Yeah, aligned with Venezuela. I mean, there's global alliance, and I just mentioned a few of them, starting with China, this global alliance. And that's my bigger concern, because, the war on drugs, we've always called it the war on drugs, So I'm still talking outside the boundaries of the United States, because I think that we should, for your audience, talk about, I think, what the greatest threat that we face may not be from outside, but it's from inside. But these drug cartels that operate out of Mexico, let's just say, but they operate globally. These are global organizations that run narcotics. They traffic in labor, right? Human traffic in labor, and they definitely human traffic in children and particularly young women around the world. So these are cartels that aren't just pushing some dope across the southern border of the United States any longer. They have grown immensely in the last two to 3 decades, and now they're very sophisticated. They do tend to operate in Mexico, although there's some in South America, particularly in Venezuela, and they operate pretty freely. And I think that they no longer represent just some criminal organizations, cartel thugs, if you will, that are just pushing dope across the southern border. I actually think they're now starting to really look at, and then have been for probably the better part of a decade or more, they're starting to gain control of places here in the United States of America. And when I say places, physical, geographic locations, such as some of the larger American cities. They have pathways and conduits to get in to work with people inside of these cities, particularly some of the larger gangs, some of the some of the criminal cartels that exist here. The MS-13 is an example of what I was thinking about. But so let's take that as sort of the periphery, and then talk a little bit about this push by these cartels, this is really not a war on drugs anymore. This is a war against a very physical and a very politically aligned and very dynamic threat that is real, and that's these criminal cartels who are part of this global alliance that we're now facing. So let's just talk about here in this country, and I'll start with China, because the Chinese, for the better part of 2.5 decades, and we can go back to at least 1998. That was when I started to really look at some data, and I've been talking about this for a long time, even before I put my uniform down. The Chinese, I just called infiltration into our institutions, right? And I think people need to understand this, because what we tend to do with particularly the current administration and frankly the media and many others, what they tend to do is they tend to make Russia the bad guy. And Russia has its warts, and we can talk about Russia, and we can talk about the war in Eastern Europe if you want, but we sort of let China have a pass with a lot of things. And we've done that because of their, we've allowed China to kind of operate with an economic sort of, rise. I mean, the Chinese, the Chinese rise economically and from a manufacturing perspective has been going on for decades. But let's just talk about one institution in the United States of America, and that's our education institution, right? Particularly undergraduate and graduate level programs all over this country. And most people don't know, if they haven't really, looked at it in detail, and maybe you've had some of these conversations on your show, but since the late 90s, the Chinese have been sending over, let's just say average lowballing at about 100,000 students per year to some of our quote-unquote finest institutions, right? The Ivy Leagues, some of the technical schools like a Georgia Tech, for example, MIT, Auburn, Alabama, University of Chicago, some of these other big name programs that have great science, technology, engineering, and math departments, right? So one particular period of time, and that was really during the let's just say 2010 to about 2016 timeframe, probably into the Trump administration, the numbers went up to about 250,000, upwards of about 500,000 per year. Chinese students coming into United States universities and spending and filling. And actually, when you look at it, who's paying for these? Those institutions are paying for them through government grants or through big endowments. So the Chinese, for well over a generation now, okay, let's just say 25 years, the Chinese have been sending some of their best and brightest to some of our top institutions and taking that knowledge and going back to China. So they're not only taking knowledge about, engineering and math programs, they're also taking knowledge about what they're learning here in the United States. And from an intelligence perspective, so that's sort of a geopolitical perspective, right? Economic perspective. But from an intelligence perspective, Jonathan, many of these students, and I'm not going to put a number on it, but let's just say a percentage, and let's just say 5% for over 25 years. 5%, let's say, were also dedicated to spying on not only the institutions, but also on other aspects of where they were at in the country, working out of Chinese consulates, working out of the Chinese embassy in Washington, D.C. So let's just say some number of them were actually trained to conduct, no kidding, spying operations, or what I would say just stealing, intellectual property, intellectual theft, right? That is such a big deal. When John Kerry was the Secretary of State, he allowed the students, because they were all coming here on one-year visas. So when John Kerry was Secretary of State, he granted a 2-year visa to these students. So now that allowed them to come in as freshmen or sophomores or whatever, or remember, graduate level and doctoral programs, that allowed these students now to stay through a summertime. And so that went on for, let's just say, 5 or 6 years. And honestly, I haven't put my finger on it today whether or not that's still the case. But what that means then is, what do these people do? What do these quote unquote students do during the summer months, right? When they're here. So they go to work for things like government institutions. They get all these intern jobs. They go out into the workforce and work. And everybody needs to keep in mind everything that I just said about Chinese students just in one institution. Never mind the economic institutions of this country, the corporate world, or government institutions, or other aspects of our democracy and our country. But these are all coming on behalf of the Chinese Communist Party. So they're not coming over here to learn to be good Democrats and good Republicans, right? Or in a constitutional republic. They're actually coming over here to learn about this country in order to bring it back to China, as our principal adversary, our principal competitor. The State Department likes to call them a competitor. They're our adversary because it's a communist ideology that looks at the United States of America and says, you're no longer going to be the world superpower. We're going to be the world superpower, particularly this century. So that's sort of an overview of one institution here domestically, and then kind of the periphery. But I'll finish with this, Jonathan, because I do believe that, and I mentioned this phrase, global alliance. There is a global alliance that has been forming against the United States for some years now. It had to come to grips with itself, and the principal economic engine behind that really only started, it's been going on for a while, but not until they were all able to get into the World Bank, and that's the BRICS, right? The Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. They just finished their first summit about 2 weeks ago since the advent of COVID. So they hadn't had any other meetings, during the last couple of years. The last one was prior to COVID. So the BRICS represents about 47% of the global population in those 5 countries. And now those 5 countries have really, I would say, 4 of them are aligned along the communist ideology now, at least the leadership. And one, I would say, is a strong candidate for probably one of the stronger Marxist countries on the planet. So those 5 countries alone represent 47% of the population on the planet. During their summit, they had about another 10 countries that had been invited to potentially join the the BRICS, what it amounts to an economic and military forum. And some of those countries are countries like the UAE, countries like Saudi Arabia. I think Turkey's in there. Venezuela is definitely in there. Iran is definitely in there. And then some others. There might even have been a representative from France that attended this past meeting, and I'm still digging into that a little bit. But just those couple of countries alone, and the numbers that were at the meeting, at the summit, that represents about 75% of the world's population in nation states. And the United States of America isn't part of it, okay? So one of the outcomes, just a small detail, one of the outcomes is that India has now started buying oil, barrels of oil, and I forget the number. I think it's like 1 million barrels a day. But they're buying it not with petrodollars. They're buying it with rupees in the case of India, right? Rupees. And so that's a big deal because it's always petrodollars in the past have always been based on the U.S. dollar and the strength of the U.S. dollar. And with the weakness out of our current administration, the rise of inflation. I mean, we're at like 9% right now. I think if you start looking at people who are in the home building business or other smaller areas, other segments of our economic system where those interest rates are higher. I mean, I said to a friend of mine last night that I was talking to about the economy, I said that I actually can see our interest rates in general potentially doubling in another year if we continue to go the direction that we're going. So, if you're a young couple and you're thinking about having a kid, your ability to buy a home these days is almost nil, right? I mean, you're gonna be living in a 1 bedroom, 1,000 square foot apartment, and that's going to cost you an arm and a leg. So all of these things that I laid out, this alliance is the thing that scares me the most, right? It's the one that because I don't believe that our government sees it, the current government that we have. I actually think that they are so aligned. I think our current administration is so aligned with China that whatever China decides to do, they're going to allow themselves to be led by the nose. Now, last comment, and I'll get off my soapbox because you asked me about our military. The military readiness that we have today is not where it needs to be, and I don't know any of the details. I just know after 20 plus years of war fighting counterterrorism and counterinsurgency, in order to take just the manpower that we have and sort of what you would call rest and refit. You need to refit, you need to re-prep, you need to re-prepare for other contingencies that you might get involved in around the world. Let's just say a China-Taiwan incursion, right? Or a big war, a big conventional type war in Europe, which is clearly it's something that could happen on any given day. We're already involved in a somewhat of a conventional war, but we're not meeting. So our military is not meeting its recruiting goals. Our military, I can tell you, after 2+ decades of war fighting, an enemy where there's really no threat to your air. You have air supremacy. Not just air superiority, you have ground supremacy, you can move around, you have the ability to communicate, you have all these wonderful capabilities that our military worked so hard to create against an enemy that was a tough enemy. And I say, I stand here and I say to myself, geez, I'm not so sure we are ready to go to war in a big way, particularly if we had what we used to call 2 major regional contingencies, right? One over in Europe and one over in the Pacific. We always have to balance those parts of the world. So I'm very, very concerned that our military is not at the readiness rates that they should be. That I think that COVID was a real problem, and our military is still overcoming the COVID nightmare and disaster that we faced. With basically throwing people out of the military because they refused to get shots because of religious, in many cases because of religious reasons. But the fact that our Army is not meeting its recruiting goals, that is something that is really, it hurts me personally because I've always been out there talking to moms and dads about letting their sons and daughters to convince them to join go serve in our armed forces because it's just a good thing to do, and it's good for them. It's service to our country. But I'm really, really concerned about the readiness rates of our military. I don't think that what we're seeing over in Europe and the amount of weapon systems that we're seeing fled over to Europe with the numbers of and the types of resources that we're providing, and it's to Ukraine. And when I say Europe, I mean it's affecting all of Europe. We're paying for it though. That when I see those kinds of weapon systems and those capabilities, I'm looking at them and I'm going, okay, so are they doing the trick? Because it looks to me like, from what I can see, it looks to me like the Ukrainians are getting crushed, and this war's a big loser, and I'm not so sure that that we're helping at this point. Very last comment: Afghanistan, because we're 2 years out of Afghanistan, and let's face it, I mean, we surrendered first, and then we retreated under fire. And we left American citizens behind enemy lines. I mean, tell me that that's wrong. Tell somebody, please, one of your great audience, some people in your great audience, tell me that's not what happened. I mean, to me, that's what happened. And so now we're looking at China, Taiwan. We're looking at the war in Eastern Europe. We're talking about nuclear weapons. We still have the problems in the Middle East. You still have emotional states like Iran, et cetera, et cetera. So anyway, I appreciate you letting me go on that soapbox.
Okay. You've given us that's a pretty daunting list. I'll just note in passing that if someone like historian Niall Ferguson speaks of us being in a new Cold War with China, but compared to the last Cold War, we weren't, our economy wasn't, inextricably tied to that of Russia. In fact, they were barely connected. We're in a much different position now. And as you say, with all of America's armaments basically going to Ukraine right now, our readiness is a real issue. But let me move on. Your military career ended during the Obama administration after you had reached the post as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. Now, your critics called you a loose cannon, but was your exit a function of your disagreement with an administration that was retreating from the war against Islamist terror and which was clearly intent on appeasing Iran? And loose cannon or not, your unwillingness to go along with policies you might have disagreed with, since that really made you something of an outlier, because as some military analysts have told me, and on this program as well, the closer military officers get to positions of power and to Washington, the more they become politicians rather than soldiers. Is that true?
Yeah, and so let me just do a quick sort of military ease for your audience, for those that don't understand. The last promotion that you have in the military is to the rank of 2-star, right? 2-star general or a 2-star admiral, a rear admiral or a major general. That's the last promotion that you get. Everything above that, 3 and 4-star, are all appointments in this case, by the President of the United States. So in my case, I was appointed twice by Barack Obama. So this, this as you in your description, and this loose cannon was appointed by Barack Obama twice, and fully confirmed by the United States Senate twice. So, so all the descriptors aside, and I served in for at least the second half of my career. Hell, the first half, my entirety of my career, I served in some really, really top-notch units, military units. Where they, the expectation is you're at the top of your field, right? You're one of the better guys in that capacity. I mean, you don't get to be the director of intelligence for Joint Special Operations Command. You don't get to be the director of intelligence for the 18th Airborne Corps or U.S. Central Command, or the Joint Staff directly serving the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, or the assistant director of national intelligence, or the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, because you're a loose cannon. Okay, that's
fair
what
enough.
I call
yes.
today. Yeah, that's what I call it today, John, and that's called a narrative assassination. Okay, they come after you because I had a falling out and a disagreement because of my time in DIA, which is one of the largest intel agencies in the world, and does have a lot of authority. That position has a lot of authority with the Department of Defense. In fact, all of the military services, Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps intelligence capabilities, they get tucked into DIA. So it's a large organization, a large amount of authority and responsibility that you have. So loose cannons don't get picked for those kinds of jobs, okay? So at the tail end, I also spent 5 years of my life in combat, most of it in the Middle East and Central Asia, principally Afghanistan. But, I was in and out of Pakistan, I was in and out of Tajikistan, I was in and out of Uzbekistan. I mean, and also I was in and out of East Africa.
And Iraq as well, right?
And Iraq as well. I mean, I spent a lot of time in Iraq. I used to joke that I lived in Balad, Iraq, and I vacationed in Bagram, Afghanistan. So because I was over there for so long. And in the time frame that when the Obama administration really had a narrative that they wanted to sell to the American people, that was basically said that ISIS is in decline, radical Islamism is in decline. Bin Laden dead, Al Qaeda's on the run. That was sort of the phrase.
I think
right?
the President Obama called them the JV.
And he called them the JV. Well, the JV, you saw what I just said in the previous segment there. You saw what the JV team in Afghanistan did to the world superpower of the United States military, right? I mean, in 2 years ago this month.
Sadly. Yeah, sadly.
Yeah, very sadly, tragically. So that was the narrative. And I wasn't, I had not only served against these guys, I had fought these elements, but my organization, the Defense Intelligence Agency, was responsible for supporting warfighters on the ground. And commanders who I knew every single one of the big 4-star guys that we had out there. And these are guys all over the world. And the ones that were in places like the Pacific, the ones that were in South America, like I'm talking about our 4-star commands, the ones that were in Africa, the ones that were in Central Command or Southwest Asia, Central Asia, even the ones in Europe, they were telling me, hey, we got these groups that are popping up all over the place. And, and I'm doing these assessments with our team, and I'm feeding this into the big beast called the U.S. intelligence community. And Jim Clapper was the DNI who I worked with damn near on a daily basis. And so, one of the very famous things was I went in front of an open hearing in Congress, and we were all asked, is basically is ISIS on the decline? And of course, the others in the intel community that were political appointees, and you could say I was a political appointee because, like I already described, being a 3-star, I was a political appointee. And at the time, Jonathan, if you looked at my political resume, I was a registered Democrat, which is interesting. So, and I when they
you're from Rhode Island, so that's not that unusual, right?
Yeah, that's right. So when they take into account all these things, I'm sure that they look at that kind of thing. Instead of saying, he's a hardcore Republican and and he's made statements. No, so I wasn't a guy that was politically anything. But I was not going to stand there or sit there in front of Congress, in front of a hearing, and toe the party line because it was not true. And what was true at the time was ISIS was clearly on the rise. They were becoming a much greater threat, and they were metastasizing not just in Iraq, but they were metastasizing all over North Africa, West Africa, Nigeria, places like Nigeria and Southwest Africa, and definitely in places like Central Asia, meaning the Central Asia tier states above Afghanistan, Pakistan, and also in Indonesia. So when you began to look at it, you're like, wait a second, I'm not going to sit there and say that this enemy is not still there. That would be false. And so pretty much right after that is when I was asked to step down. And I understood, I'm a soldier, and I got it. And so But right away, what they start to do, and they do this even when I was going into the national security advisor position. You start to see these articles about loose cannon, and they call it Flynn facts and some of these other things. I mean, you got to always consider the source of where it comes from, right? Where does that information come from, and what media source? Heck, the other day, Jonathan, on the Morning Joe show, this is only like 2 weeks ago. They're calling the guest that was on there. I won't mention his name, but the guest that was on there, who actually, when I was going in to be the national security advisor, wanted to meet me to be the deputy national security advisor. So I'll leave it at that. You can go dig up that the other day. This is about 2 weeks ago. So that individual wanted to be the deputy national security advisor for Trump, and actually let it be known to me that he was interested. Okay. The other day he's talking about Trump and I, him and Joe, talking about Trump and I, how this would be the greatest threat to our democracy ever to have this combination back inside of the White House. I mean, we're in trouble. We're in trouble there, Jonathan, and I don't know who your audience is or what your audience comprises, but and I'm certain that it's international. I'm 100% certain it's international, and definitely here in the United States. The United States of America is in grave risk right now, and if you aren't paying attention, then you need to pay attention, and you need to understand that there is an alliance, as I've already walked through, and there is a complicity by people in the current administration, and there is a rise of, I would just call it, socialist and Marxist tendencies, and it's been going on for a long time. I mean, Trump didn't cause this. This has been happening for, hell, I'd take you back to the Eisenhower era if you want, but it's always been there. It's just gotten to the place now where it's now in our face, and when they saw that they could not defeat Trump in 2016, where they thought that they were going to, and that you'd have 8 years of Obama, 8 years of Hillary, and then you and I wouldn't be having this conversation. When that didn't happen, then they had to take sort of measures in their own hands, and now we are facing this period, this era of our history, where I do believe that we have one more shot at a presidential election. And I can't sit here and tell you. All I can tell you is that the only person that knows the outcome of that election is God at this point, because I'm seeing all the indicators of sort of this continued fraudulent system of elections that we have, and everybody's fighting tooth and nail to kind of look underneath the carpet and go, well, is there something there? Is there something, is it broken? Is our election system broken? Because the one thing in this country that I certainly know that when, in all the time that I was willing to sacrifice my life, that we were fighting for was an equality. And one of the things that makes us equal in the United States of America is our sacrosanct privilege of voting. And right now that vote is at risk because it just doesn't feel, and it doesn't feel like it's done fairly. It just does not feel like we have a fair process. And I think the various polls that the Wall Street Journal has done, Reuters has done, it clearly shows that the numbers of people in this country that don't feel like our vote counts anymore or is fair, our voting process is fair, or it's like, I think it's somewhere between 60 and 70% from those organizations that do what I would call some pretty legitimate polling. And you say to yourself, why is it that we got to this point where nobody wants to allow us to look under the hood, right? Nobody wants an audit of our voting systems, but yet in the past, there have been, and this goes back to the days of the Bush-Gore debacle in the year 2000, right, where there was a big argument down in Florida with only one county, and And the Democrats went crazy for auditing and doing all this. There's there's all kinds of videos and tapes out there that talk to all that. And to me, it's like you and I, people, all of us, the IRS audits every single American every single year by looking at your tax paper, and they do a cursory look. In some cases, they'll do a much more than just a cursory look. But every one of us gets audited. Everybody gets audited. You get audited every time you have to pay your taxes, and you fill out some form and you turn it in. You hope that you've done everything correctly, and it's such a complicated system, so you have to get accountants and accounting firms to even do it sometimes. But all of us goes through this. Why is it that our voting system, we are not allowed to do that? I just think it's a shame. I think it's a shame that the United States of America, which I know we're fully capable of doing it, we should be able to do an audit. And frankly, those audits should be done at the county level or at the state level, because the federal government won't be able to do an audit of a county or a state, and it shouldn't be your responsibility anyway. In fact, I think actually it's not. I'm not an expert on the Constitution, but I think the Constitution gives states and lower more authority when it comes to voting. That's why there's all these different rules and policies for voting. If we don't get this fixed, Jonathan, and we go through another election and we have, sort of the same sentiment, the same feeling, then I'm afraid that like a lot of empires in the history of nation states throughout the history of the world that have risen and fallen, maybe we're in that. Maybe we're in that part of the sine wave of history. I pray that we're not.
Yeah, well, let's hope we're not in the late Republic stage. You came to a lot of people's notice for the first time during the 2016 presidential campaign for your presence at Trump rallies, speaking to crowds. And the thing that people always remember or link to you are the chants about locking up Hillary Clinton because of her handling of classified material. Now, irrespective of Clinton's conduct, do you now think back upon that in light of the political prosecutions being visited on Republicans today? And do you have any sort of sense of regret? Because I think some people might argue that sort of, it may not have started with you, but it may have been part of a spirit of fueling, sort of this lawfare against political opponents that has sort of sunk us into a very deep morass in our political culture.
Well, you're putting a lot of burden on my shoulders. I mean,
well, I'm specifically saying it's not all you, but you are remembered for that.
You know what? If I look back with any regret, then I couldn't live with myself. I don't regret anything. I live my life the way I live it. I have a great, a great upbringing with great parents and a wonderful big family. And politics was never something that I thought I would ever get involved in. Coming out of the military, I got involved because I saw our country basically turning towards socialism, communism, and Marxism. And I think that we're in a worse place today than back in 2016. I think that the founders of this country demonstrated two things, among others. But they demonstrated two things. They demonstrated personal courage for their actions of not only creating this wonderful experiment and this beautiful document, and their own personal courage of standing up for the country. But the other thing that they demonstrated and did so by their actions was they demonstrated a sense of accountability. And I think that what we've lost in this country is that. I think that we still have courageous people. I think we still have people that are willing to stand up. But I think that those that are in charge, or certainly have been in charge, or these authority figures in our country, have lost this sense of accountability of themselves, and they don't hold themselves accountable. My military upbringing, hell, my childhood upbringing, we were accountable in our house, right? I mean, if you did something wrong, you would own up to it, and then you'd be punished for it. But in the military, you take responsibility and you take accountability of your own actions first before you start looking around and blaming everybody else, right? You don't do that, just especially as a leader. As a leader, you don't go and start pointing fingers going, it's you, Jonathan, you're the one that did that. No, you go, you say to yourself, what did I do wrong to cause this kind of an environment? And then how can I get better? You learn from it, right? But I think that we have lost a sense of accountability in this country for actions. I mean, I do, because I as a military officer, especially as a senior military officer, having people arrested for violating classified procedures in the military. Okay, so there are people that are arrested and put into jail, went through the rigors of a hearing, and then were put into jail or busted in rank or something along the lines of they're being held accountable because they knew they were trained on how to do something, they were told how to do it and how not to do it, and they failed to do it, and in some cases, if it was intentional, right? If it was intentional. If it was unintentional, you give them the benefit of the doubt, right? It's like tie goes to the run. And you give a soldier, particularly somebody serving that's willing to give their life, if you give them the benefit of the doubt, if they weren't intentionally just got dumb one day and they left some material in a purse or in their cargo pocket and they walked out the door with it, right? And you go, hey, wait a second, but if you all of a sudden, if you find somebody doing that too often, you start wondering about them. Well, now we have people at the highest levels of our government that did these things, and nobody was held accountable. And frankly, right as you and I are speaking today, I don't know who's been held accountable, other than if you're a conservative, and I generally call myself a conservative today, although I'm probably still sort of center of the road person, but if you're a conservative aligned to Donald Trump, Jesus, you're getting attacked left and right. And this is insane. And we can't keep going like this. This can't happen. If you did something wrong, and in the case of Hillary, it was clear. I mean, the director of the FBI at the time, Comey, said so. He got up and publicly said so. He just happened to caveat it with a phrase there, and I forget the exact wording, so I won't try to recall what that wording was, but he caveated with a phrase that wasn't criminal in nature, and he let her off the hook because she was the candidate for the Democratic ticket at the time. So, but then nothing happened. And frankly, a guy like Trump comes into office in 2016 because we did work our tails off to get him elected. He comes into office in 2016, and what does he do? He basically says, let's let bygones be bygones. Tough campaign. We all kind of gave the thumbs up. Donald Trump didn't get vindictive. Okay, he could have said one of his first acts, what could have been a special counsel of his choosing to go after Hillary Clinton, and he could have made a decision at the end of it, whether the special counsel came back with nothing or something. I mean, he didn't. And maybe he regrets that. Maybe he regrets that. I don't know. You have to ask him. But I think that what those that are persecuting, continuing to persecute for political reasons need to understand is that at a certain point in time, and I'm not going to sit here and say that like Trump has said, well, if we get back into power, you better be careful because now we know, right? I mean, at a certain point in time, and I believe, right? I don't wear it on my sleeve, but you're either going to meet your maker at the pearly gates or the gates of hell. And what's the message? Like they say, you got to meet Peter at the pearly gates, and Peter's going to ask me, what do you think? How was your life? And you're going to go, like you just asked me. I'm going to say I don't have any regrets. I gave it my all. I believe what I believe, and I gave it my best shot. And if that means he sends me back to purgatory and hope that a whole bunch of people start saying Hail Marys for me, and I hope that they do. But courage and accountability, we still maintain, I think, people with courage, but we have lost sight of what accountability truly means in this country, and we're going to have to get back to that.
Yeah. I don't want to spend, really that much time rehashing on this program, rehashing the Russian collusion hoax story, which is well known. But the general impression in the corporate media of the events of the end of 2016 and the start of 2017, when you were about to begin serving as National Security Advisor, was that the reason you were forced out was that you had not told the truth about your consulting work for the Erdogan regime in Turkey, or about your contacts with Russia during that period. Is that true? I mean, I'm just putting it out there.
No,
was there a lot more to that than those, sort of capsule statements?
Yeah.
And so let's do it briefly.
If anybody really wants to dig, I'm sorry, Jonathan. Anybody really wants to dig, we just filed about 2 months ago. I filed a lawsuit against the Department of Justice and the Executive Office of the President under Obama. A lawsuit back up to the government. And we're still in the haggling of issues in the court that we filed it in. But if somebody wanted to read that, that's a good document. If you really wanted to go do some research, that's online. The other thing is, if you paid any attention to the Durham report or to the Durham hearing, and then what came out from the Department of Justice, what the Department of Justice filed when they dismissed my case, right? The Department of Justice dismissed my case, and essentially, what happened was there was no crime committed at all. The whole thing, we use the word fake, but this is beyond being fake. This is egregious government misconduct against somebody who was, not only duly elected as the President of the United States, but then used the power of the presidency to then appoint somebody, in this case me, as his National Security Advisor, and they're very, it's a very famous meeting, 5 January 2017, which is documented in the Durham report. It's documented in the filings that we put out, and it's documented in evidence. That's the day, I call it the day when the coup started. It was a meeting in the Oval Office. President Obama held that meeting, and there's some very famous people that were in that meeting, to include our current president, but Joe Biden was in that meeting, and so all that stuff that you mentioned aside, all of that was found to be not a problem, that there was no crime committed, and yet they created the elements of a crime. Now, as a person with a family, and in the decisions that I make, if people go, "Oh, he pled guilty," yeah, put yourself into my shoes for 2 seconds, and know at that moment in time what was happening. Okay, what was happening, and the timing, and particularly the going after my family. Which is a big deal, I'll take a bullet for my family.
Of course,
and I did, because I didn't want my family to continue to go through this craziness. And so, 99% of I'll back it off a little bit. 95% of the cases that go in front of the Department of Justice end in a conviction. 95%. The Department of Justice does not seek the truth; they seek convictions. Because that's how they get promoted. That's how they are incentivized. 95%, Jonathan. That's documented. So, that's again, people got to go do some research about it, because it's complicated. But it was dismissed principally because of egregious government misconduct, because there was no crime committed. Yet they dragged me and my family, and then it's not just my family; it's friends. I have 9 brothers and sisters. They have kids and grandkids. My wife has 7. They have kids and grandkids, right? So just in our 2 families alone, we've got 16 siblings. And then you've got another, I think, 50 or 60 nieces and nephews, right? I mean, they don't understand. They don't care. They don't care what they drag all of us through. What they want is they want your hide, because you stood up for Donald Trump. And then the other aspect of that is, this is why Obama, in a very famous meeting with Trump transitioning the government, he says, you can't hire this guy, Mike Flynn. Why? What was he? You know what? And I'll tell you, because I've just recently said this to maybe 1 or 2 others. I never met Obama. Never met the guy, which is fascinating, because you think, why did this guy hate me so much? We've never met. But he hired me. He hired me twice. And he did it as the President of the United States of America, hired me twice for 2 really, really important jobs, as I mentioned earlier. So it's fascinating, the times that we face.
Yes. I might note in passing, and the supposedly controversial contacts you had with Russia that was much mooted about at that time. You were actually trying to influence just before you took office, Obama's efforts to basically single out Israel in the UN and trying to stop that.
You know what they never do, Jonathan? What the media never does is they never play the clip of my speech in Moscow, which I was asked to go there to talk about. I was asked to go there to talk about ISIS and the rise of ISIS, right? And I really hammered Russia. I hammered them. They never talk about that. You never even see. In fact, it's probably, if you probably Google it, you probably couldn't find it. But the speech that I gave for a paid speaking event, which I was part of a speakers bureau out of Washington, D.C. to go do that. It's very famous, very famous. So, go ahead.
Yes, well, I think that's clear. Now, you've talked a bit already about your concerns about election integrity. You were criticized in particular for your statements after the 2020 elections, not just for questioning the results of an election, which was clearly not conducted in the same way as previous ones because of the COVID pandemic. But at one point, you were calling for the imposition of martial law in order to have a revote. There were many people, including probably some who voted for President Trump, who thought that was over the top and the sort of advocacy that might have done more harm than good in some way. And do you think that was an unreasonable thing to suggest at the time?
No. And I wrote, so I did not call for the imposition of martial law. That's a falsehood. That's a falsehood. So
that's the line that's out there. Yeah.
Yeah. You go back and you look at the statement. Or actually, it was a Newsmax interview with I forget the guy now, but it was a Newsmax interview. So you go back and you look at that. So that's a falsehood. But a president of the United States has options, right? And that was one of the things that I was talking about, was really options that a president has to basically give the people confidence that the elections that we had actually, have a level of clarity and honesty and trust that the president of the United States has options. I mean, and among those options are use of different tools and capabilities. I mean, so it wasn't like, we got to impose martial law. That's the way the media presents it. Media presents it like that, and and then they say, they talk about the famous meeting in the White House that we were in there talking about martial. That's all bullshit. It's all media made up BS, and they do it because maybe it'll get them some clicks, or maybe it'll get them a special counsel like Smith to take a harder look at Flynn. Believe me, if all of that was, if everything they said about me, Jonathan, was true, I wouldn't be talking to you today. These people would be so after me, but they know that because I'm very thoughtful about what I do say, and you don't get to the level that I got to in the military, nor in political life. You don't get to be appointed. They don't sprinkle fairy dust and poof, you're the director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, or you're the national security advisor to a duly elected president of the United States of America. You don't get to those levels for being a loose cannon or for being, unthoughtful about what it is that you understand about not only our nation, but about this historical place that we sit today. And we sit in a very, like I said earlier, this is a grave risk time frame that we are in. And I like to think that the American people are not done. I mean, I don't believe we are. And that we'll find a way out of this. We're going to find a way out of this. I believe that. I have to believe that. I have to believe that. And I always tell people,
You're skipping ahead to my final question about whether you're optimistic, but I'll give you another shot at that later. But I'm also obligated to ask you about a couple of your statements that were a focus of controversy in the Jewish community, which is, great interest to our audience. And in one, you said in a speech, I think it was, quote, if we're going to have one nation under God, which we must, we have to have one religion, one nation under God, and one religion under God. unquote. Now, that sounded to a lot of people, and I have to say, even myself at the time, like more than just an anodyne expression of faith, but something that sounded like something like a call for a state religion, something that would be obviously contrary.
I mean, I think I was introduced in a Christian band at the time, and I think I just, it was a slip of the tongue. Honestly, it was just a mistake. We're one nation under God, and I'm a big believer in our Pledge of Allegiance. Right, 1954 was when they added under God.
Right.
So I just introducing a Christian band that was starting off that particular part of one of our events, and that's just all that was. Just that was a mistake.
Okay, fair enough.
I've seen
That. Because obviously that raises issues about the First Amendment and religious minorities and scaring them. But that's a fair answer. Now, more recently, really just a few weeks ago, during a speech, which I have to say I went back and watched the entirety of, you spoke about the plight of families being, during the Holocaust, being marched to the trains to take them to the death camps. And there were some, particularly my colleagues at the Forward, interpreted what you said as being insensitive to the victims or accusing them of being passive. Was that what you meant? I didn't personally take that from it, but explain it for the audience that didn't hear the speech.
Well, and I appreciate you bringing it up, but also watching it, the full context of it. And I've said this a bunch of times. In the last 100 years, we've had 4 dictators, Stalin, Hitler, Mao, and Pol Pot, that have resulted in about 120 million deaths of their own citizenry, okay? And so, like we've said, I mean, when we talk about not just the Holocaust, I mean, the extermination of damn near 20 million plus, right? I mean, that's just Hitler. So the idea is that people think, and there's always this phrase, never again, never again, never again. Well, in the last 100 years, so not in a very long period of time, which is not long in the history of the world, we've had 4 dictators, and there's others, you can throw in like Idi Amin or even others that have been around. Saddam is another one that you could add in there. You have the Taliban for what they were doing to their own people inside of Afghanistan prior to us going in. So the idea exists that evil, I guess the best way to put it is, and I think I said this part of that speech to a bunch of pastors up in Michigan, that the sobering reality is that evil exists, and we cannot think that it doesn't, and we cannot think that it will never happen again. And so part of it is a reminder that people have done these things to human beings, to their own citizens over time, and we can't allow this to happen again. The horrific nature of what dictators, let's just say dictators, right, will do to their own people for power, we can never let it happen again, ever. And we cannot. And so to me, it's like a reminder. And it was my, as I experienced that, going through that sort of walk, and then
you were speaking of your own experience visiting Auschwitz.
Yeah, and it was so sad, but it's a reminder. It's a reminder that we've got to stand up against this. We cannot allow this to happen. It will happen again. I mean, it will happen again if we don't constantly remind ourselves, and we don't put ourselves into the position where, okay, how will I react if this happens? I want people to understand. You have to put yourself in a place where, when you join the military, and you sign on the dotted line as a young person, you're not signing up to be a cook or an infantryman or an aviator. You're signing up to give your life for your country. And I think that all of us need to really be thinking about this as we go forward here in our own country. If we move more and more closer to this outcome that some of these people, that this globalist community wants to do to America, and don't think for a second that evil goes away because we think it. We just think that that's what's going to happen because we want it to. It won't. It will always exist.
Well, it's going on right now in in Western China and, with the Uyghurs.
It's horrific. It's
Right.
horrific. So anyway, I just, that's kind of where I'm at. And said there was media articles about moms telling their babies, giving their baby. I mean, that was the experience that I went through. And I was watching this and being explained all this by some really good people walking through it. I'm thinking to myself, man, how could we ever, could that happen again? Was my thinking. And the answer is it could happen again. And we need to be honest. So we need to be looking for those kinds of indicators that I do believe exist out there, and we have to stand against it. We cannot have evil like a Hitler or a Stalin or a Mao. I mean, if it were up to the Chinese, believe me, the Chinese would come in, would warp traipse into the United States today and take over and enslave this entire population just for the energy resources we have in this country. Never mind food and water, which are two other resources that they need.
Well, let's get back to your expertise on security issues. Where do you see the alliance between Israel and the U.S. today, as the Biden administration still seems bent on appeasing Iran and also snubbing the Netanyahu government?
Yeah, I actually think it's there's good people, but I do think that if you really take a hard look at this administration and they're cozying up to Hamas, definitely, not cozying up to, but partnering with Iran. I mean, if I were in Israel, I would be worried. If I was, part of the cabinet. I mean, Israel, and I've described Israel. Israel is just like, I don't know. It's this life raft of democracy in a sea that is churning around them in the Middle East. You're right, the greater Middle East, from even parts of Africa and certainly over into the the Persian Empire and in Central Asia. I mean, it's this life raft of democracy, and there's such a geopolitical jealousy on the part of many of these other countries against Israel, and so I think Israel needs to constantly remind America, what it represents, because it represents a lot. It represents an awful lot of stability in this otherwise hurricane or cyclone of evil.
Yeah.
In some cases, right? And so I think that today, what I see an administration that's cozying up to Hamas, cozying up to the things that the Palestinian, the various Palestinian factions, right, that exist, and then literally partnering with Iran. I mean, this is not a cozying up to. This is partnering. This is like a partnership. A country that has said we are going to wipe Israel off the map. I mean, talk about things that are just so vastly different. When we say, oh, we're the greatest partner to Israel, but we're going to cozy up to a country, we're going to partner with a country that says we're ready to wipe Israel off the map. Well, I mean, for a guy that has great respect, particularly for the members of the Israeli military, and I've spent a lot of time over in Israel over my military career and work closely with them, I can tell you, Iran has every desire to do that, and the people of Israel know it. They know it, and it's well within their capability to do it, and it'd even be worse, it'd even be more in their capability to do it if the United States, if this administration continues to give the capabilities to Iran that they want to give to them. I mean, this is insane. This is insane.
Yeah, I might add in passing that the principal architect of appeasement of Iran, Robert Malley, who's now been suspended clearly for security and possibly violations of the handling of classified material, and possibly passing to the Iranians.
You don't even hear about that, Jonathan. I mean, that's, I don't want to bring that up because that would be like I'm being, mean. But, I mean, these are the type of people that we're dealing with. Listen, I do have to run. I have to run, and I will come back. And I appreciate you and your audience. I appreciate your patience getting me on. And I will come back and answer, others. I'd love to have conversations like this, because this is particularly, maybe we hone in on the situation in the Middle East because it's not done. We're not done. It'll never be done. It's actually, it's something that that the United States of America is always going to have to hold on to because, frankly, we have to protect democracies wherever we can around the world. And frankly, the only one that I really see right now around the world, to try to put my finger on it, is Israel. God, I don't really know. Maybe you could say the United Kingdom, but that's a monarch, So anyway.
General Flynn, thanks so much for joining us today and for giving your take on the issues and for giving us a lot to think about. I also want to thank our audience. Please remember to tune in every day for Top Story Daily Edition. And whether you're listening to us on Apple, Google Play, Spotify, or any of the other podcast platforms, or watching us live on Facebook or Twitter, or on the JNS YouTube channel, please like and or subscribe to Top Story. Click on the bell for notifications and give us good reviews. Please write to us at editor@jns.org and let us know where you listen or watch the show and what you think about it. And remember, keep reading and thinking for yourself. And we'll see you again next week.